Welcome to a brief presentation of the ISO ANSI 80369-3 ENFit connectors compared to existing Enteral connectors. This presentation is prepared by GI Design Associates. The purpose of this presentation is to first demonstrate that existing connectors do not misconnect with rigid IV luer systems and certain airway tracheostomy tubes, but unfortunately, the ENFit connector does misconnect in an unsafe manner with existing rigid IV luer systems and certain airway tracheostomy tubes. The other purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate the differences in flow volume between existing enteral feeding bolus connectors and the male ENFit connector.
This is a typical tracheostomy airway tube system. This is an IV luer system with a luer slip on one port. This is a typical needle cannula having an IV luer slip. These are the various existing enteral connectors and oral enteric syringes, as well as the existing enteral delivery sets. We can see that if we were to take the tracheostomy tube, the existing Y-port system does not engage. We can see another Y-port from another manufacturer. That does not engage. We can see a bolus syringe adapter from another manufacturer. That does not engage. We can take another Y-port from a percutaneous endoscopic feeding tube. That doesn't engage. We can take the oral enteric syringes. We can see that that does not engage. We can take the standard delivery set, either gravity or pump. That does not engage. Now, if we were to take and remove these connectors and then substitute the ENFit syringe as well as an ENFit delivery set. Let's see what happens here. If we were to take the ENFit syringe into the tracheostomy tube, it forms a perfect fit, wherein enteral fluid can be administered into the airway. Simultaneously, an IV luer slip port, the syringe can form an IV connection to a side port, again with the administration of fluid into an IV port system. Also, if we were to remove the needle cannula plug and insert this, it fits into an IV system, IV luer slip system, as shown. The same is true of the ENFit delivery set system. Don't forget the needle cannula infuses a certain amount of fluid in and out prior to removing of the needle to confirm placement of the cannula. So it is possible to administer IV fluid into an IV cannula having a luer slip. The same is true with an IV system.
part 2 of this presentation by GI Design Associates, we'll demonstrate the differences in flow volume between the existing bolus feeding connectors and the male ENFit connector.
This is a 2 times actual scale representation comparing the existing bolus feeding connector on a 24 French peg tube and the comparison with the ENFit connector attached to the same 24 French peg tube. And then we will have another visual here showing in the orange portion, the constricted ENFit connector within the bolus enteral feeding connector. The bolus feeding connector has an internal flow path diameter of 4.65 millimeters in internal diameter. In comparison, the ENFit connector only has a 2.95 millimeter ID connector. And as you can see here, the orange, which is the ENFit connector, having the flow path of only 2.95 millimeters ID, fits drastically within the much larger 4.65 millimeter ID of the existing bolus feeding connector. This can best be demonstrated by the actual comparison between the two devices. This is a typical 60 cc syringe. Here is the bolus feeding adapter for a 24 French peg tube. This happens to be a probe which is exactly 4.65 millimeter in internal diameter, and as you can see, it fits directly into the bolus feeding adapter, which gives you a very smooth laminar flow within the device. By comparison, if we were to take a look at the male portion of an ENFit adapter, which has been constructed in order to fit into a 24 French peg tube, you can see that, of course, it cannot fit. Also, by comparison, here is a similar probe, wherein this probe is just slightly over 2.95 millimeters ID, and as you can see, that cannot fit inside of this. And it cannot even fit inside. You can see how it bumps up against the flow path. So this 2.95 millimeter ENFit connector is severely constricted when compared to the much larger flow path in the bolus enteric connector, which can actually take up to 4.65 millimeters. What does this actually mean? This means that the ENFit connector, having an internal diameter of 2.95 millimeters, when compared to the existing bolus connector having an internal diameter of 4.65 millimeters ID, the actual flow volume formula is volume equals the diameter to the 4th power. If we take this formula and transmit it into the ENFit connector compared to the 24 French bolus ENFit diameter connector, the ENFit connector has an 84% lower flow volume versus the existing 24 French bolus connector. That is a severe drastic reduction in the flow volume when compared to the two devices, leading to obstructive flow when used with the existing enteral formula or used with any kind of blenderized food when enteral formula is delivered by both syringes.
Welcome to part 3 of the GI Design Associates presentation comparing the ENFit connector with existing enteral connectors. During part 2 of our presentation, we discussed how the ENFit connector has a 2.95 millimeter internal diameter versus the existing bolus connector having a 4.65 millimeter ID. We will now demonstrate how that translates into practical demonstrations using first isosource 1.5 formula and then using orange juice with pulp.
I'm now going to take the existing bolus connector attach it to a 60 cc syringe. I'm going to take the ENFit syringe and attach it to the connector, the male connector that attaches to it. I will first use the ISO source and determine how long it will take to administer 60 cc's of ISO source in the bolus connector by timing it, and we can compare that to the flow path in the ENFit connector. But first let's do the bolus. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007, 1008. It took 8 seconds to flow 60 cc's through the bolus connector. Let's try the same time using the same ISO source from the same container using the ENFit connector. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007, 1008, 1009, 1010, 1011, 1012, 1013, 1014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. It took 30 seconds compared to the 8 seconds administered through the bolus connector. That is a tremendous difference in flow volume rate. Now let's do this with the existing orange juice. Let's see how this flows. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007. That's it, about 7 seconds, almost about the same. Now let's try this with our ENFit. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007, 1008. It has stopped flowing after 8 seconds. Now it kind of does again, but it's now stopped at about 25 mLs. So this ENFit connector is now clogged.
Thank you for watching Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3 of this presentation.